we do have a handout for this specific presentation. So I believe the PDF is going to be dropped in the chat box on the Zoom. But if you want a paper copy and you're in person, we're going to be passing that around. And so this one is we're gonna go a little bit deeper into statistics about native nutrition. And then it's kind of on one side, it's about native nutrition statistics. And then on the other side, it's kind of like a primer for one of our panels about how we can support Indigenous nutrition in our healthcare systems or Indigenous food and healthcare systems. So Marnie is passing that around for us. So our topic today, I should probably get on the stage, but our topic today is called Including Indigenous Food and Communities in Diabetes Care. For better or worse, Native communities have this story about having high rates of diabetes in our communities, and it's totally valid. And so I often get a lot of requests to talk about, well, how do we talk about nutrition education for our patients or people who have diabetes? And so this is kind of getting to some of that. I am also a certified diabetes care and education specialist and have a lot of experience in helping people who have diabetes manage their food choices, but also medications as well. So if you have questions about that, we can go into that. All right, so let's get into it. I have an issue with talking a lot. And so let me see if I can get this one done in an expedient way. There's my disclaimers. Objectives, we're going to be talking about social determinants of health that influence, sorry, I put gestational, but diabetes in Native communities. We're going to be looking at some demographic data as well, and then discuss implications for how we develop our interventions. And then also how do we develop culturally sensitive nutrition counseling for managing diabetes with focus on traditional foods. We're also going to be talking about the ADCES 7 self-care behaviors and how we apply that in Native communities. Who's heard of the ADCES 7 self-care behaviors? We got one person. Okay, good. We're all new to this. We're all babies to this, so it's great. All right, so quick question. Pull out your phone. How much do you know about diabetes in Native communities? All right, the answers, the multiple choice answers would be A, very familiar, B, somewhat familiar, C, not very familiar, D, not at all familiar. And let's see if we can get up to 50 again. While I drink my coffee. Got 42, 43. Okay. Okay. So if you're on Zoom, you can scan this QR code, but it was dropped in the chat box as well. We're at 48. We need 2 more people, 49. 54. Okay. So it sounds like many of us are very familiar. They have in-depth knowledge and or they have direct experience working with Native populations affected by diabetes. And then runner-up is not very familiar with 28% there. They said they're aware of some general information, but haven't had formal training. Well, this is your formal training. All right. Actually, okay, maybe I need to let go of my emotional support coffee. All right, so let's get into it. Just some background statistics about Native communities, just to kind of set the context. Population, there's about 6.3 million people who identify as Native. And if you understand like blood quantum and stuff, that includes like all blood quantums. And diversity, there's 547 federally recognized tribes, divided into like 9 general regions. We're in the Southwest region, kind of like bordering on Plains region. There's like the Northwest region, the California region, Southeast, Northeast, and those, and Alaska Native as well. As far as language goes and how much is spoken, so in the entire US, there's 381 distinct languages according to the census data that's spoken. However, half of those languages are indigenous languages that are spoken. So pretty cool, huh? 167 indigenous languages. We make up like pretty much the majority of languages that are out there. Unfortunately, it's estimated that only 20 native languages will be spoken by 2050. Food, historically, we've been a mix of hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists, heavily influenced by environment. So like the Southwest, we're gonna be in the desert. So the focus more is on agriculture, which is why corn is very much integrated into our communities, because that requires agriculture, versus like somewhere that's more plant biodiverse, like the Northwest. There's probably less emphasis on growing food on the land, and more emphasis on gathering like salmon or berries. So it just depends on where we live, which is why like sometimes when I go to other tribes and I'm like, I have no idea, no idea where, they're coming from. I kind of have to do my own research before I go out to different tribes. Like next month, I'm going to Northern Valley Indian Health Center. And their community is like Chumash and California natives. And I have no clue. So I have to kind of ask like, okay, what are some foods that you identify with, not just indigenous foods, but those cultural foods, so I can integrate it into my presentations and my workshops. So that's, as people who work in non-native people who work in healthcare communities, that's on us to figure out, to learn, to continually learn. And then I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Some more statistics. When it comes to water, Native households are 19 times more likely to live in a household without indoor plumbing. And really, a lot of those statistics are skewed because of the Navajo population. Navajo, it's estimated like 30% of our households don't have indoor plumbing. I did see some info from the EPA that actually went down to like around 10%, but there's like no formal release of data yet. It was just like on a random website from the EPA, so I don't know how true that is. And because Navajo is one of the largest tribes in the nation, it's going to skew those numbers. So if you work in other tribal regions, for the most part, I think they might have more access to indoor plumbing. Food, we're pretty highly food insecure, like I said, about up to 75% of our households, especially living on the reservation. Any reservation report up to 75% food insecurity. And then electricity, 14% of households have no access to electricity, which is 10 times higher than the national average. Again, that number is skewed by Navajo Nation. We have the highest amount, so that number is going to kind of push that number towards not having as much electricity. Economy, national poverty rate for Native Americans was 25%, while it's sitting at 10% for white people. So just quickly, social determinants of health. I like to highlight this because it's important to understand when we're implementing nutrition education. We have to keep all of these things in mind, this whole running list. Like I said, in school, we were taught, tell people to have fresh food and, eat more plant-based proteins like tofu, but it's like, well, you go on a res, that's not available. It's just a reality of the situation. And so when it comes to social determinants of health, we're looking at higher rates of poverty. We're looking at lack of running water, lack of basic utilities, inadequate access to healthy food, inadequate access to healthcare providers, lack of access to broadband for telehealth or virtual education, lack of health insurance. Sometimes there's a lack of reliable transportation, and then there's also higher rates of sexual and interpersonal violence or higher rates of trauma. Native communities are two to three times more at risk for being diagnosed with PTSD, which I sometimes feel like is, falsely low because there's a lot of stigma about going in to get diagnosed. Yours truly has been diagnosed with PTSD, so that's how rampant it is. So, when I talk about these social determinants of health, I also like to talk about, well, this didn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's like, oh, that's ta-da, we're in this situation. There was history, there were policies, there were reasons behind it that created this environment of these social determinants of health. So that would be like what we call structural determinants of health. So who's heard of the term structural determinants of health? It's a pretty new term. And it's basically talking about those policies, that political environment, which cause the kind of downstream effect of these social determinants of health. So it's kind of going a little bit more upstream and looking at structures and systems of why this might have happened. So for us, it's first contact, it's colonization, it's the Removal Act of 1830. It's the Dawes Act of 1887. It's scorched earth policy. Many of us Navajos were rounded up, taken to Huelte, Bosque Redondo, and all of our crops were burned to the ground. All of our sheep were killed. It's failed treaty obligations. It's federal oversight for healthcare. IHS is incredibly underfunded. It's the boarding school era. Many of my parents' generation and older went to boarding school, and that affected those traditional foodways knowledge from passing down. That language, my parents told me, like, we just didn't think you would have as successful a life if you learned Navajo. That's what they told me, because I had a whole conversation with them and that was the end of it. And then natural resource extraction, looking at the levels of indoor plumbing, and how we get water, how much water, is it contaminated? And then, there were policies of forced sterilization and infant separation policies as well. So those are kind of, create this whole stage of healthcare disparities when we're talking about Native communities. And disparities, these are the rates. Diabetes were 3.2 times more likely, and again, that's on your handouts. 6.6 times more likely to have alcohol-induced events, 4.6 times more likely to have liver disease, 1.5 times more likely to have drug-induced events, kidney disease, higher rates, suicide, higher rates. And so all of these, it didn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's because of these structural and social determinants of health. So when we're talking about nutrition education interventions, that's where we can dig in and be like, okay, how do we talk about nutrition, but also keep all of these other issues in mind? I can't just go into a community and be like, everybody needs to eat salmon and berries, because there's other things I gotta think about. So, all right. So again, going back to this is when we're talking about definition of health. Sometimes when I go into Native communities, I say, okay, what makes a healthy person, or what makes a healthy family? And for the most part, people say, like, you're at a lower BMI, you're in a smaller body size, you're thinner, you salad. That's what makes a healthy person. And I'm like, salad doesn't make you a healthy person. It's all of these things. And, it's just not about the food that we eat, the movement that we do. It's about all of these other things. Those lifestyle behaviors is just a sliver of it. So I understand why maybe your A1C is 14. And so that's where me just coming in, just having this more global understanding of what is health, it really helps me to kind of just make sure I'm coming to my community in a humble way, and I'm not, penalizing them for not having access to certain things. So these things, at least according to the CDC, it's education, healthcare, neighborhood and environment, social and community, and economic stability. So what does this mean for people with diabetes? So all of these questions are things that would go on in my mind when I was meeting somebody who had diabetes. So when it comes to access to healthcare, questions like, can the person reach their healthcare team? Is the person comfortable advocating for themselves? So like I said, people with higher levels of trauma, they may not be very comfortable advocating for themselves. Are there enough providers in the facility? Are the providers culturally inclusive? Are the medications appropriate? And what are the side effects? When it comes to neighborhood and environment, asking, does the person feel safe at home? In their neighborhood, are there safe places to be active? What zip code do they live in? Do they have transportation? Do they have adequate housing? When it comes to social and community, are people supported emotionally, spiritually? Are they engaged in their community? Does the person experience discrimination? And are they stressed? Most of us are stressed, right? So that's like a yes for everyone. Economic stability, again, does the person have a job? What are their bills? Do they have debts? What about, can they access food? And can they access financial capital if they needed to? And if they did, how do they get it? Do they go to like a loan place where they have really high interest rates? Like, how do they get their access to their money? Are they on SSI? Do they get SNAP? Education, asking, does the person understand their condition? Many people are health illiterate. They just, it's like when you say a kidney is the same thing as a lung, like in the eyes of like most community members who don't have that health literacy. Before I went through all this medical training, like I was like, what's the difference between a kidney and a liver? I don't know. Now I know, but most people don't. They get it mixed up. For people in my community, they would often get blood pressure mixed up with glucose. And so they would say, oh, my glucose was high, but they would be referring to their blood pressure. And so, again, just thinking about those things, again, can the person read directions? Can the person access the education, and what languages do they speak? And so for me too, we're going to talk a little bit about it tomorrow, but many in our community say we're visual learners. And that's what our elders always say. We're visual learners. When you ask an elder for directions, they're going to take out a stick and start drawing in the sand, right? And be like, this is the way you go to the clinic. And that's how we describe things. And so does our nutrition education match with how people learn? If people want to draw and see those visual representations, and that's how we have to deliver nutrition and diabetes education. So I'm very much a fan of infographics. So if you see my presentations are intentionally designed where there's minimal words despite those questions, but I always forget those questions. That's why I put it up there. But I design it in a way that it's very heavy on visuals, because that's how we learn best. So now let's get into intervention and education. That's me on a cornfield. We did a cooking class on a cornfield. That was fun. We're doing it again this year, but we got to wait for when the corn pollen is good. Okay, so I asked earlier about the ADCES 7 self-care behaviors. Many of us didn't know, but let's get it in a more formal way. I think my phone's a little greasy. Problems of being a native. All right. All right, so let's try to get up to 50 again. While I drink some water. All right, we're at 47. Close enough. D, sounds like most people are not familiar, 54% of us. This is my first time hearing about it. Not very familiar. Second answer was 22% of us said not very familiar. I've heard the term, but don't know what it includes. And 15% say somewhat familiar, 9% say very familiar. So the ADCES, ADCES stands for, somebody help me here, somebody who's a CD, Association for Diabetes Care and Education Specialists, right? Yes, I got it. So ADCES is the professional organization for diabetes educators. Like myself, like CDCESs, we're our own professional organization. And their emphasis is really on educating and meeting patients where they're at if they have diabetes. And so they developed a framework to help us think about how do we effectively educate patients. And so just a primer on glucose recommendations. This is just for people who have diabetes. Sometimes it's confusing for people in my community about, okay, what's the level or what's the parameters for diagnosis versus when you're managing. And so just keeping that in mind. And so this is, so like for instance, for diagnosis, what's the fasting glucose for diagnosis? Yep, greater than 126. And then a lab A1C is 6.5, right? And so some people, they get that mixed up between that's for diagnosis, but now let's say we're diagnosed, now we go into management. And management is a little bit more flexible, understanding that, people's ranges change throughout the day. People have busy lives. And so this is what is recommended. A fasting plasma glucose is going to be 80 to 130. 2-hour postprandial, meaning like 2 hours after they have a meal, it should be less than 180. And then the A1C hopefully is between 6 and 7. Sometimes people can get it less than 6, but sometimes they run the risk of getting low blood sugars or recurrent hypoglycemia. And so especially for like elders who have diabetes, I think a safe point for me, at least from my experience, is like trying to get less than 8. If we have an elder who's super motivated for whatever reason, then we can do 6 to 7. But if they're running into like more low blood sugars, then we need to be a little bit more flexible with that. So my question is, how do we achieve this in Navajo and other Indigenous communities? And how do we frame it using the evidence or using the frameworks based on evidence-based care like the ADCES 7 self-care behaviors? So this is what the ADCES 7 self-care behaviors are. The goal of this is to work from the inside of the ring to the outer ring. So you see how in the middle there's people. The goal is to put the person first, not the condition. And so when I say diabetes, I'm saying people with diabetes. I'm not saying diabetic. And so that's ADCES guidance, is to say people with diabetes, person diagnosed with diabetes, because it's putting the person first, understanding this is a person that is just diagnosed. They're very complicated. So we work on building trust with the person. We can work on healthy coping techniques because diabetes is very life-changing. For Native communities, there's a lot of stigma around being diagnosed with diabetes. They may have had family members who lost legs, who had amputations, who were on dialysis. It can be a very traumatic experience. And so we want to be very cognizant that we need to address healthy coping first. How do you feel about your condition? Or is there any way I can support you with your condition before we go straight into like, you need a A1C level of 6 to 7. It's about building that trust. And then next level is, now we can start getting into like tactics and strategies, like taking medication, looking at their medications, healthy eating, being active. Often when we talk about diabetes, everybody wants to talk about nutrition. And I'm like, what about reducing stress? Nobody wants to talk about that. But I'm like, it's so important because this person's like running on 5 hours of sleep, and they're taking care of 3 grandkids and 2 children and all these other things. And it's like, it's the stress. It's not the eating. Maybe it is part of the eating, but that can be from reacting to the stress. And then the next level is monitoring. So how are we checking our blood sugars? And then the last thing is problem solving and reducing risks. So problem solving is like, just trying to like troubleshoot about what's going on with the person. Like if they're always waking up with a blood sugar less than 70, what are some ways to prevent that from happening? If they're how are they going to take their insulin when they're traveling on a plane? That's kind of like troubleshooting or problem solving. Reducing risks is also about just doing those, having those behaviors that reduce your risks for complications. And so things like doing your annual foot checks, eye checks, and then just coming in annually to make sure, we're not, running into complications. Again, the whole focus of this is to make sure that we are upholding, supporting quality of life. Because often people with diabetes, they get so overwhelmed and their quality of life, deteriorates. And they feel like it's a full-time job. And in some ways, it is a full-time job. And we ask a lot of our patients with diabetes. It's very, very time intensive. So we need to be cognizant of that. And then again, just understanding that health behaviors, these all overlap. What do you do when you're at a gym working out? And how do we reduce the risk for a low blood sugar? They all overlap, right? What are we thinking about with eating and reducing risks? Those would be the two ways that they would overlap. And then ultimately the goal is to support self-determination. Like we said, health is not one size fits all. Health is not everybody having an A1C of 6.5%. It means different things for different people. So now we get into ADC's ES7 self-care behaviors. So I actually presented this to the national conference last year. So this is what's being pulled from that, because I wanted to bring this highlight of like, how do we integrate these techniques into, I guess you would call it a niche community. And so this is like my Navajo perspective. I am Navajo. This is where I get a lot of my experience from. But if there's other people who identify with other Indigenous communities, you can think of other ways to implement the 7 self-care behaviors. So when we're looking at healthy coping, that's talking about how do we feel confident in our ability to manage diabetes? How do we manage stress related to diabetes? And so for Native communities, especially as practitioners, we can look at, okay, how does this Indigenous community define health, And for Navajo communities, IHS is really awesome about implementing Navajo wellness model. There's definitely whole day trainings about this. And so I think that's helpful, especially if you're coming in as an outsider. And then next thing is acknowledging the power of words. In many Native communities, we didn't have written language before colonization. So there's this understanding that words are powerful. And so ADCES also recognize words are powerful. They have a really great guidance on how language matters and how we adjust our terminology to make sure it's highlighting the person first. So for example, instead of using the word diabetic, we say person with diabetes. Instead of saying non-compliant or non-adherent, we say not managing or not engaged in their condition, or indicate some other level, or just describing the behaviors. Patient eats, drinks a 12-pack of soda a day. That's it. We don't have to say like non-compliant with diet, because I have no idea what that means. And I don't know like what your definition of a healthy diet is. So we have to be more objective in how we are addressing, especially in our notes. And then supporting community. again, building community around diabetes management is really helpful too, because I'm a healthcare professional, but sometimes I feel like patients who talk to other patients about how they handled a certain situation is more helpful than me saying it. I don't know why, but people just feel better about, if their sister said, "Hey, I take snacks with me when I go to the gym." And I could have said that, but it's kind of like, with my husband. I'm like, I tell him about nutrition stuff and he doesn't believe me until he sees it on YouTube. And I'm like, I said that like 3 years ago, but whatever. Um, so, all right, so let's get into healthy eating. So we talked a lot about that in the last presentation with the diabetes plate. So we have the My Plate and then we have My Native Plate. But different professional organizations, I didn't actually understand this when I was a newbie, but different professional organizations have different ways of recommending healthy food. So ADA, American Diabetes Association, and ADCES, they have their diabetes plate, where the diabetes plate is half your plate is non-starchy vegetables, a quarter is protein, a quarter is some kind of like starchy food. Starchy or carbohydrate food like fruits or grains. And so that's how they recommend it. So just understanding like there's a difference. And again, it depends on, what your patient has access to. So I modeled this after the ADA's diabetes plates. And I kind of put in food that resonates more with Native communities. When you look at the actual ADA diabetes plate, they have like really random like foods you can only get at Whole Foods. And it's not very helpful if our patients see that and be like, well, I can't get quinoa. I can't get chia seeds. I can't get salmon at Bash's. Maybe you can at the fancy ones like Window Rock or Tuba City, but other ones probably not. So relying more on like budget friendly foods like carrots, celery, onions, and then also having space for some of those frozen foods, those canned foods, because again, reminding people or reminding us that people may not have access to certain amenities like refrigeration. So canned green beans are a great non-starchy vegetable. Canned carrots, frozen foods like frozen broccoli. Of course, you need electricity with that, but again, it just depends on the person's goals. Carbs, things like corn products, flour products, potatoes, winter squash, beans, pumpkin, those are going to be the carb foods. And then protein, turkey, peanuts, nuts, beef, pork chops. I always like to joke that pork chops is like our indigenous food at this point. Same with spaghetti, like everybody eats spaghetti and pork chops. Mutton, canned meat like Spam. And I know, some of us privileged people like to say don't eat Spam, but the reality is our communities eat Spam. So how do we use an additive approach with that? And then eggs and cheese as well. So this is just an example of how I would show people, again, leaning into that additive approach instead of just saying you need to stop eating that, thinking about what can you add in to add nutrition. And then again, encourage a mix of carbs, fats, proteins, because again, that's going to help with blood sugar spikes. If they have nothing but blue corn mush, that is, going to result in a higher blood spike than if they added in some peanut butter or if they had a hard boiled egg on the side. And so again, thinking that, yeah, carbs are going to make our sugars go up, but protein and fat helps kind of moderate the level. And again, I like to tell people learn which indigenous and cultural foods belong in each group. If you're working for another Native community that's not Navajo, maybe there's other foods that people like. So, all right. So getting on to the next one, being active, gardening and farming. Again, thinking about nutrition interventions, how do we incorporate gardening and farming? For us, Southwest tribes, we're more agricultural leaning. And so how do we incorporate concepts of gardening and farming, traditional dance, and then running? Running is also a spiritual movement for some tribes. And so thinking about how do we integrate that in. Taking medications, again, thinking about, yeah, we're, thinking about Atlantis, we're thinking about, basal bolus types of insulins. Yes, but also, more native centric types of medications. How are they, if they are traditional, not all Native people are traditional. Not all Native people use traditional medicines or ceremonies. So just being aware of that. So for us Navajos, corn pollen is pretty important to our ceremonies. For other tribes, it can be sweetgrass, and then also laughter. I like to say laughter is medicine, right? And that again goes back to healthy coping. How are we coping about this? So, how do we integrate laughter into our diabetes education? So I like to say talk with local practitioners too. They have a lot of knowledge and advice. Many clinics who serve Native populations are starting to integrate more traditional practitioners into their departments. Arizona, was it Arizona or New Mexico, who just passed a law that covers traditional medicine for Medicaid. So that's cool, right? So monitoring, when it comes to blood sugar monitoring, that's a whole beast in itself because nobody wants to poke themselves every single day, right? I have many different techniques, but we won't go into that. I feel like that's a whole other just 1 hour presentation. But I do want to remind you, just think about water and electricity access. Like for instance, if we're telling people to wash their hands when they need to monitor their blood sugars, but they have to haul in water, maybe we should provide them with more alcohol swabs so that they don't have to use their water supply as much. For instance, sometimes pharmacy is the one that's giving out the alcohol swabs, and they have like a cap on how much alcohol swabs they can give out just because of resource limitations. So just thinking about how we can be a little bit more creative. Again, looking at health literacy. In main, I don't know, I guess I want to call it mainstream nutrition education. It's, they say, have, especially when we're doing like medication changes, do fasting, blood sugar, and then 3 postprandials during the day, and then do nighttime blood sugar monitoring. So that's 5 times that we're telling people to monitor their sugars during one day, and understanding that that's confusing if you say it out loud. Again, thinking about having some kind of visual representation, and then also thinking, is it really necessary to advise people to do 5 times a day? Maybe there's a technique where we kind of stack, where we say just focus on fasting on Sunday. On Monday, do your 2 hours after breakfast. On Tuesday, do your 2 hours after dinner. Because really what we're looking for is just patterns. We're not looking for 5 times a day. It's great if you can do it, but your hands are going to hurt after a while. So how do we just capture a pattern without making the person go like hate us because we're telling them to check their blood sugar so often? And so there's different ways to do it. And that's how I tell patients is like, we're just looking for a pattern. Once we kind of figure out your pattern, maybe you're higher in the morning, so we need to adjust this medication. Maybe you're higher in the evening, so we need to adjust this medication, or maybe think about incorporating walks. Once we kind of get a pattern, the person feels confident, we don't have to do as much blood sugar checks too. And so I like to tell people, like, if you just feel weird, like just check your sugars. Again, thinking about computer, internet, and cell phone access, many of the meters that are coming out now are like Bluetooth enabled, and it's got all these fancy gizmos and stuff. And for the most part, like patients, that's not an appeal to us. Maybe it is for other people, but it's just not, really a thing unless it's city natives, then they're really into it. But, just thinking about how do we kind of work around this computer access. Many of our patients don't know that you can actually, if they bring in their meter, you can hook it up to the computers at the hospital and it downloads the pattern. So then that way you can look at how they're doing throughout the past month since you've seen them. You can look at a pattern and see how to manage what's going on. Again, getting to problem solving, this is the 6th behavior. And so again, thinking about considering creative ways which honor our culture can help us navigate. So again, thinking about how do we think about health? How do we integrate those concepts into our advice about problem solving? So for example, in Navajo, Hajjon is something that that is a wellness belief. And so how do we, again, Hajjon means balance in Navajo. How do we kind of bring that concept into our diabetes education? And so again, making key messages sticky. Like again, I like to lead with visuals, and that's how we do it. Instead of just giving them a stack of text, like especially in ICU, that was my thing. I was like, patient gets diagnosed with diabetes, their A1C is 15, and they get like 20 pages about diabetes that's printed off from the EMR. And I'm like, that's firewood, you guys. Like, just be real. That's gonna go into the fire and keep somebody warm, which, you know, I'm glad they're keeping themselves warm, but that's a reality. Nobody's gonna read it. I wouldn't want to read it. And so again, just making key messages sticky. If you want to dig more into this, looking into something called universal design, which comes from the community with people with disabilities. And so universal design is a really good way. University of Kentucky has really amazing nutrition training on how to integrate universal design into your nutrition education products and handouts. They're amazing. And then again, going back to how do we help people remember? Because when people go into the hospital, it's just like, well, all this stuff, like, let me do this and let me do that and let me look at your feet. And a lot of stuff, there's a lot of stimuli. And so that means people aren't going to remember. And so it's our job as healthcare professionals to just double check to see if they can remember. So that's where we use the teach back method. And so I like to say, like, in your own words, tell me what I just said to you. And that's just like a quick check on like, okay, are you actually listening? Or are you just being polite and nodding? Which is something. How are we on time? Okay, I'll be quicker. Again, last one, reducing risks. This one's a little bit touchy because often when people get diagnosed with diabetes, one of their providers ends up saying, you're going to lose a leg if you don't manage your diabetes, or you're going to lose a leg if your A1C is 15 for long. And that is definitely a no-no in Native communities. Do not do that. Remember, words matter. And sometimes for Navajo communities, especially too, that means you're putting it out in the universe that that's going to happen. You're willing it to happen. And so that's where we need to be careful about saying that. And some of the techniques that I've it is a reality, right? If somebody isn't managing their blood sugars, they're more prone to infections, they're more prone to kidney failure, they're more prone to all these other things. Yeah, that's a reality. I'm not saying don't talk about it. I'm saying talk about it in a way that kind of, you know, gets around me saying, this is what's going to happen to you, and being more direct. And so some of the ways I like to do it is I like to use third person language. I say people with A1Cs of 14 are more at risk for this. Or I use a story about a person who had A1C of 14. If you don't know, A1C 14, not good. Anything above 9, not good. But I like to say like, hey, one of my other patients, I always say that. I always used to say that. One of my other patients had an A1C of 14, and they had a really hard time healing from that one wound on their shin. And it's probably because their blood sugars were really, really high. Their blood sugars just prevented them from healing, and that's what happened to them. And so getting around that and using more third person language instead of saying like, you're gonna get an infection from that shin wound. And so that, that was a little bit more of a gentler way or more compassionate way to get around talking about risks. Um, and that's what I heard a lot from my past patients is they said, well, I went to the ER, they told me I had diabetes, and they told me that I was going to lose a kidney or I was going to lose a leg. So I never went back. 10 years, they're back in the hospital with DKA. And it's like, well, we just prevented them from coming back for those whole 10 years. So just keeping that in mind. Again, words matter. And then again, thinking about how do we address barriers through our programs and policies. Sometimes it's really hard for patients to get a 60-day supply of insulin and they live way out in the boonies. And so how do we as professionals address some of these policies, internal hospital policies about how we offer this, offer the support that they need? We can do something about that. That's a policy thing. It's an internal policy thing. Like, again, reducing risk. Also, I like to talk about seeking permission to educate. So I always think that, so number one thing for me is building trust with the patient, but also one of the ways we build trust is to ask permission to educate, ask permission to discuss this issue, especially if somebody else is present too, because that person may not know what's going on with the patient. So just saying like, hey, is it okay if we talk about your blood sugars? Hey, is it okay if we talk about your eating habits? Hey, is it okay if we talk about your medications? Hey, is it okay if we talk about your monitor? Hey, is it okay if we talk about the wound that's going on here? Even if that's what they're there at the hospital for, it always makes them feel like they're in the driver's seat. Most, like 95% of the time, people will say yes. And if they say no, okay, let's go somewhere else. Is there some other thing you want to talk about? And that also builds trust too. They have the ability to say no, and we're going to respect that boundary. All right, so just some more effective teaching aids for our communities with diabetes. Again, I like to say make it pretty, use colors where we can, focus on using graphics and colors to address lower literacy levels. When you end up ordering handouts online, make sure you do a thorough vetting of is there more text on that or is there more visuals on there? And with Native communities, it's really hard to find handouts that reflect our communities. So for me, I've had to learn graphic design just because I wanted to make sure that that representation was on there. Because if you have a, person that doesn't look Native and they're eating a salad and looking happy, then sometimes that sets up in their mind like, well, only those people eat that way. And so we have to be mindful about how we're representing our populations too. Cooking classes, that's one of my specialties, is cooking classes. When I started my company, I actually was like, I'm never doing cooking classes because I know how intense they are. They are emotionally draining, they're physically draining. But that was something I got asked about a lot. And I was like, fine, I'll do cooking classes. And it turns out I actually really enjoy them. So I really like cooking classes. And so I would also say integrate WIC and SNAP foods because again, many of our people are receiving those benefits. When we're working with referrals, encourage patients to make an appointment with dietitians. As dietitians, we have just in general, we have really high no-show rates. In my hospital, I think it was like 60% no-show rate, so which is a lot. They have positions called diabetes health coaches, and then also exercise specialists. And I would always say with referrals, please make sure you are asking permission to refer them. Some people would come to my office and be like, I didn't know my provider referred me here, but I'm here. And that just already sets up a weird dynamic. So, and then again, make sure we're spreading out info, like just focus on one topic. Don't focus, like I said, we expect our patients with diabetes to be superheroes and tackle all the things. But that's not a reality, right? So we need to be empathetic and understand that, everybody learns in bits and pieces. And that's why, we intentionally made more breaks. That's why I intentionally incorporate more polls, because it's good to switch things up a little bit and have little nuggets. And then just hone in on those nuggets. So again, this is something I like to use with my patients that makes it a little bit more visual. This is actually based off of a handout I made, or I would do it if I didn't have the handout. I actually like to draw it out because people like to see the drawing while I'm drawing. And I say, okay, just imagine when we're thinking about diabetes, and I draw a square and I say, one corner is physical activity, one corner is medications, one corner is food, one corner is stress and sleep. Now with diabetes, it's your choice about which one you want to focus on, which one looks like it stands out to you more. And then people would be like, I've never seen diabetes management like that. And I say it's always a balance, we always have a choice on which one we really want to focus in. It's always your choice. The way we determine if any of those four things are working is by monitoring. So if you are really adamant about taking 10-minute walks after your dinner, we can check that to see if it's actually improving, to see if it's actually working. And it gives people more of like an oomph and being like, okay, it actually is working. I'm going to do it again. Same thing with physical activity, same thing with food. Let's say the person tries to eat more protein at breakfast. How is that going to affect their levels later on during the day? And I say, we can check that with monitoring. And so I had a handout that had this, but it's not as impactful as like doing the drawings, like doing the elder and getting down on the floor. Maybe you could do that in the dirt, but I like to draw it out in real life person. And this kind of helps explain balance. It also helps promote patient autonomy. So I like this quote from Miller and Rolnick. If you don't know Miller and Rolnick, they're the founders of motivational interviewing. That's how I initially learned how to counsel, is through motivational interviewing when I used to work in Chinle. They said there's very little evidence for the belief that people will change if you can just make them feel bad, scared, ashamed, or humiliated enough. It is the supportive, compassionate, empathetic practitioner who is most effective in inspiring behavior change. So you can't help people change if you shame them. That's just, there's no evidence on that. All right, so quick question. Which of the following is not one of the ADCES 7 self-care behaviors? And that is a prompt to pull out your phone and ask or answer. Okay. So possible answers are monitoring, annual foot exams, reducing risks, or problem solving. So we got 30 people. Yay, 97% of us said annual foot exams is not one of the self-care behaviors. It's a component of reducing risk, but that's not like one of the main things. All right, cool. So I like to also lead with when you're, talking to a person with diabetes, it's always important to make sure the person feels like they can collaborate with you. And that you're walking on this journey with them. So affirmations are a really great way to do that. We'll dig more into it, but these are the affirmations I like to use with my patients. The one that I really like to use is thank you for coming. That shows a lot of commitment to your health. It shows you're interested in your health. They made the decision to get in their car and drive over. That's a lot of effort, and we should recognize that. So there's some other examples, but I did have a case study, but we'll skip that. And yeah, the conclusion is like, we need to understand social determinants of health when we're talking about diabetes education. And we can support nutrition evidence or evidence-based nutrition messages, but we can also make sure that we're customizing it and tailoring it for our Native communities. And also understanding that our words matter. Our words matter. And it's very important to make sure that we are talking in a way that supports collaboration. So that's it. Now it's lunch. We can do Q&A. We can do Q&A, but
We got a
sorry.
Q&A. So Madison, one of our nutrition
Sorry.
students, is going to be walking around with the mic. We'll take 2 audience questions, and then we'll take 2 questions from our Zoomies.
Questions, information overload. It's okay too.
I noticed when you were talking about the 5 blood sugar tests, that seems to assume people eat 3 meals a day.
Yep.
Do you find that to be common practice or something?
Eating 3 meals a day is not a thing in Native communities. Usually if there were 2 meals that were going to be chosen is breakfast and dinner, but I've met a lot of people who skip breakfast, skip lunch, and they have dinner. The thing about that is they have all 3 meals at dinner time. So they're going to have maybe 2 servings of dinner because our bodies are smart. They know something's up. They know they need food. And so that means it's, they're going to eat a little more at dinner time. And that starts a cycle where they're having 2 or 3 meals essentially at dinner time because they're skipping breakfast and lunch. And then in the morning when they wake up, they're not hungry because yeah, you had a lot of food and it's still all in your tummy by the time you wake up. And so again, assessing like somebody's personal meal patterns, meal habits really helps with when you're making recommendations for that monitoring too. So we tailor that to the person. And it just depends on their goal too, is maybe they want to lower their fastings and they want to adjust their basal insulin. And we do that by, we lower the fastings if they're on insulin. We do that through adjusting the basal insulin. And we can say like, look, your fastings are really high. We can either adjust your Lantus or we can look at how much you're eating at dinner time because that can also affect your fastings too. So it really depends. And again, it's just that tailoring of messaging to our patients. Zoomy?
You talked about what your plate will look like. What would snack look like?
That one is in my 5th presentation, but just quick primer. Again, making messages sticky. So again, I like to go off of food groups. So what are the 5 food groups, you guys? Grains, proteins, veg. Not fats. Dairy. What was the last one? Fruits. Did we already say that? So when it comes to, again, visual learning, like nobody's going to say like, oh, a snack is 300 calories and at least 10 grams of protein with 30 grams of carbs. Nobody resonates with that. And so I like to book things or do things in terms of food groups because it's a little bit more visual. So I say for a meal, we're shooting for 3 to 5 food groups. And then for a snack, it's 1 to 2 food groups. So like this morning, when you think about what you had for breakfast, for me, I had a muffin and I would classify a muffin as a grain. A pretty tiny one. It had blueberries in it, but not enough blueberries for me to say like a full serving of blueberries. So I would say I just had a grain. So that's on me. I didn't have a proper balanced meal. And so now I think about, well, what can I add in? Well, maybe what I could have done is I could have gotten some fruits. I could have gotten a boiled egg, bumped it up to the level of a balanced meal. So with a snack, same thing, 1 to 2 food groups, maybe cottage cheese and fruit cocktail, string cheese and an orange, string cheese and an apple, a graham cracker and I don't know, cheese, something like that. So that's how I like to do balance. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. But that's how we just make sure like we're doing it in a little bit more culturally appropriate way. visual forward. Any other questions?
The question I have is, what strategies have you found most effective for helping people to integrate the stress management into the diabetic care? And how do you approach that? How do you approach the conversation?
If you have a robust behavioral health department in your facility, I would say definitely partnering with them. We don't, which is the case for many clinics. And when I used to work in the facility too, behavioral health was just down the hall from me. I'm like, please be my friend. Like, I really want you to be my friend. But as dietitians and healthcare professionals, there are other tactics we can use. That's why I like to teach mindful eating workshops with patients. And I have like a whole other workshop about how do we mindful eat. And I like to focus on practicing in on a native food. So like I bring in blue corn mush or something, or Chief Chin, and I go walk through people with how do you mindfully eat? How do you think about your emotions? For the most part, sometimes they don't know how to identify emotions and where they're feeling it in their body. And so I like to talk about that when we're eating something. How do we feel these different emotions? And I like to give them that wheel of emotions. It goes through like all the bunch of different emotions. And I say, which one are you feeling when you're eating this now? And so just kind of getting back to some of those mindful eating tactics with stress management. I like to talk to people about okay, let's say you don't have a table and a chair to sit at to mindfully eat. How do you do it in your car when you're on your way to work? And there's maybe techniques we can do. There's still ways we can do that when we're in a rush. Maybe we can just slow down and be like, okay, I'm feeling stressed and I'm eating a blueberry muffin. There it is. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more techniques. We do have some psychologists in the room to talk about that too. So maybe you two can connect. But yes, next question.
Is it okay to use phrasing like nutritionist food instead of healthy food to attempt to get people out of the mindset of Eurocentric health standards? What are some ways we can do this?
Yeah, like I said, the same thing with fry bread. You get 100 people in the room and you get 100 different opinions about fry bread. Same thing with nutrition. You get 100 people in the room, you got 100 different opinions on what they understand as healthy food. I find the same thing as using it as nutritious foods. It's kind of like a synonym, kind of like compliant and non-adherent. And again, I think it goes back to understanding how is that person defining healthy food? That's where I like to dig in. And that's, what I incorporate into my classes sometimes is like, what do you think is healthy? That's where we can kind of get an idea of where they're coming from, and then maybe we can kind of help fill in gaps. So I like to, instead of me saying healthy food, because I know everybody has a different definition, that's where I say, for me, I say balanced. And that leads the way into me talking about those 5 food groups. 3 to 5 is a meal, 1 to 2 is a snack, maybe 1 to 3 is a snack if a person's more active. So I like to say balanced. I also like to say nourishing, because nourishing also recognizes not just the physical element, but that emotional element. Something can be emotionally nourishing, and that's okay too. So that's where I like to use those 2 words. Yeah. Another
How
one?
do you address the huge push for processed food and how additive they are to members of addictive to they are to members of the community?
I think when it comes to understanding the role of processed foods in Native communities, I think, again, taking another step back and understanding why. Why is that the case? Why do people feel the need to purchase ultra processed foods? And I'm guessing they're talking more about ultra processed foods, because in general, everything that we eat is processed, right? Cooking is a process, drying is a process, you know, everything is processed, even that fresh vegetable you get from the grocery store, that's been through a process. For the most part, when people talk about processed food, they're talking about ultra processed. And I would just say, be curious about why they feel the need to purchase that, and also be compassionate. You know, maybe that ultra processed food is the only food that they're going to be able to eat. So how do we add in more nutrition to those ultra processed foods? And my opinion is, you know, you can't be addicted to food. Like, food is something that's like saying you're addicted to air. You know, food is something that nourishes our body and it gives us nutrition. It's like saying you're addicted to going to the restroom when you need to use the restroom. It's like that's a biological function. And so you can't be addicted to a biological function. And even though people like to cite like, oh, the brain scans and whatever, and it's like, well, you're not, you know, selling yourself on the streets to get a bag of Cheetos. Like, that's addiction, you know? And so I just don't think there can be an addiction to food. That's just my opinion. But again, I would also say lead with compassion, lead why that is. And then not only that, but also understanding, well, if there's barriers to accessing fresh foods, what you deem as quote unquote healthy foods, then how do we provide nutrition interventions that address that barrier? If a person can only get ramen noodles and Cheetos, then how do we develop interventions that increase access to nourishing foods? So it's not enough for me just to say, you're addicted to ultra processed foods, you need to stop eating it. And then that's the end of the conversation. It's like, no, we need to offer solutions, you know, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. But all right, next, or are we good?
We're going to have to stop here with Q&A, but of